Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. In ancient Chinese feudal dynasties, the emperor's every action was closely tied to the fate of the country, making him the subject of constant attention. As a normal man, the emperor was inevitably faced with the awkwardness of his first sexual experience. As the supreme ruler, he was surrounded by thousands of beautiful women in the imperial harem. Those who received the emperor's favor had their own status elevated, and the task of producing royal heirs rested solely on the emperor. Even the most experienced lovers, however, would inevitably feel some discomfort in their first experience. Therefore, in ancient feudal society, emperors placed great importance on their first sexual experience. During their period of innocence, emperors were usually introduced to the act by three types of women: wet nurses, palace maids, and the empress or concubines. But which choice was the most appropriate? What does this reflect about the historical and moral views of the time? How should we view this issue in the context of modern developments? According to some historical scholars, in ancient China, after a prince was born, he was raised by a wet nurse. The wet nurse not only took care of the prince's daily needs but also provided sexual education. Due to the separation of genders, male officials could not directly offer this education, and thus it was passed on quietly by women. The relationship between the wet nurse and the prince was often one of deep attachment. Wet nurses were typically much older than the princes, having undergone sexual maturation earlier. Under the constraints of feudal rights, the prince often developed feelings of affection and gratitude toward the wet nurse. Some emperors, after ascending the throne, would reward their wet nurses as a gesture of appreciation. A typical example is the relationship between the Ming Emperor Qianlong, Zhu Jianshan, and his wet nurse, Wan Zheng'er. From the age of 2, Wan Zheng'er took care of Zhu Jianshan's daily life and remained by his side during his most difficult times. 15 years later, when Zhu Jianshan ascended the throne, one of his first acts was to elevate Wan Zheng'er to the rank of imperial concubine. Prior to this, Wan Zheng'er had been the one to guide him through his sexual education. The wet nurse, having been a close confidant and caretaker to the prince, often embodied warmth and comfort, making her the earliest source of affection in the prince's memories. As the prince grew older and faced vague uncertainties, he would naturally turn to the wet nurse for guidance. Drawing upon her own experiences, the wet nurse would gently explain the differences between men and women, helping to usher him into adulthood. The wet nurse's innocence and wisdom were crucial in the prince's maturation, and he would feel immense gratitude for the nurturing milk that had sustained him. Therefore, when the prince finally had the chance to repay his wet nurse, offering his first sexual experience to her seemed both natural and respectful. It was a way to repay the intimate guidance she had provided and show the utmost respect for the care she had given him. For a young, naive prince, the wet nurse was undoubtedly the safest and most appropriate choice for his first sexual encounter. However, this seemingly logical relationship was criticized at the time. Many people believed that the emperor's relationship with the wet nurse was tainted by the bond of nurturance and violated ethical principles. Furthermore, given the wet nurse's lower social status, her intimacy with the emperor could be seen as inappropriate and out of place, especially considering the significant age difference between them, which could make the relationship appear exploitative. As a result, most emperors would only briefly turn to their wet nurses to help them through this awkward period, but would rarely bring them into the imperial harem. The emperor would often send the wet nurse away afterward as a sign of purity. Such relationships were ultimately difficult for outsiders to accept or understand, and they became secretive, often stigmatized, parts of the emperor's early experiences. However, in modern times, we should not be too quick to judge the actions of the ancient emperors, but rather try to understand their circumstances. They were, after all, young and naive themselves, seeking a trustworthy guide during their sexual awakening. The wet nurse, naturally, took on this role. While we may not approve of such a relationship, we can understand that the emperor's intentions were pure and should not be hastily criticized. In addition to the wet nurse, an emperor's first sexual experience was often with a favored palace maid. These maids were typically selected by their families for their purity of status and outstanding beauty, and were meant to guide the emperor through his sexual education. Palace maids would patiently explain the matters of men and women to the emperor during his confused period, and they would often willingly offer themselves, becoming the emperor's experiment. A more typical example is Emperor Guangxu and the palace maid Jiaqing. Jiaqing, not only beautiful but also eloquent, enjoyed the favor of Emperor Guangxu. When the emperor felt some uncertainty about sexual matters, she became his confidant and his first sexual partner. Later, Emperor Guangxu promoted her to the rank of concubine. The reason why palace maids became the emperor's sexual awakening objects is also due to various considerations. The emperor needed to maintain the highest level of authority and could not show even a hint of ignorance in front of others. Palace maids, by nature, held low status and dared not speak out, making them the best candidates for keeping secrets. They typically learned how to serve the emperor early on and could subtly guide him, helping him navigate through awkward situations. Moreover, before ascending the throne, the emperor needed to master how to manage the imperial harem. And the palace maids could serve as his practice subjects, allowing him to gain experience. If a palace maid could become the emperor's first, she would also have a chance to be promoted. For her, this was a gift from the heavens. Therefore, the emperor would select one of the most attractive and discreet maids among many, secretly offering her his first experience. However, such a relationship is also controversial. First, there is a huge disparity in status between the emperor and the palace maid. Second, the emperor only used the palace maid to satisfy his temporary desires, with little regard for her feelings. She was often discarded afterward, treated as a mere plaything, and once the emperor had used her, she lost her value. Today, we certainly understand the profound inequality inherent in such relationships. But in the historical context of the time, this approach could perhaps be seen as the emperor's helplessness. He could not appear weak in front of others, and the palace maid became his learning tool. We should not solely criticize the ancients from a moral perspective, but focus on eliminating the root of such inequality, gender and status disparity. Of course, there were also a few emperors who reserved their first sexual experience for their beloved women. This mostly occurred before a prince ascended the throne, when he would choose a woman of similar status to become his consort or wife. The two youthful hearts would support each other and navigate through the awkward phase together. The most typical examples of this are the love stories between Hongli and Rui, and Yongzheng and Qianfei. Hongli entered the bridal chamber with Rui on their wedding night and offered his first to her. When Yongzheng was still Injun, he had already married Qianfei through formal rites, and they had a very loving relationship. Injun also reserved his first experience for Qianfei on their wedding night. This form of relationship is most in line with ethical concepts, reflecting the sincerity of mutual love between a man and a woman. The prince's ability to restrain his desires, keep his integrity, and give his most precious first experience to his beloved is truly rare. Such feelings transcend social status and the exploitation of the weak by power. They are built on mutual support and respect between two hearts, and therefore are most likely to receive blessings from the people of the time. According to related historical scholars, under the constraints of feudal rights, ancient society imposed very strict behavioral norms on both men and women, particularly on women's chastity. Women were required to remain chaste, while princes, as the grandsons of emperors, also had to maintain decorum in front of others, behaving properly without any mistakes. The emperor's first sexual experience carried various pressures and expectations. Therefore, emperors who could keep their integrity and reserve their first sexual experience for their beloved were not common. Such emperors had to face pressure from society, family, and power, and needed to balance emotions with responsibilities. Their actions were like walking on thin ice, requiring extreme caution. This suggests that they might become wise rulers. After all, as a leader, showing a broad and compassionate heart is a universal expectation of great emperors, both in ancient times and today. However, regarding the first sexual experience and coming of age for ancient emperors, most would choose a wet nurse or palace maid as their partner. This choice reflects the rigid class system of ancient society. However, with the changes of the times, we should now uphold the values of equality and freedom, respecting everyone's ethical choices and autonomy. This is the History and Culture channel. Liking and subscribing are the greatest help and support to us. Thank you everyone and see you in the next time.